Du débat, the honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
We must protect Canadians in the digital age, but C-63 is not the way to do it. It forces Canadians to make unnecessary trade-offs between the guarantee of their security and their charter rights. Today I'll explain why C-63 is deeply flawed and why it does not protect Canadians' rights sufficiently, and more importantly, I'll present a comprehensive alternative plan that is more respectful of Canadians' charter rights and will provide immediate protections for Canadians facing online harms. The core problem with Bill C-63 is how the government has chosen to frame the myriad of harms that occur in digital space as homogeneous and capable of being solved with one approach or piece of legislation. In reality, harms that occur online is an incredibly heterogeneous set of problems requiring a multitude of tailored solutions. It may sound like the former might be more difficult to achieve than the latter, but this isn't the case. It is relatively easy to inventory the multitudes of problems which occur online and cause Canadians harm. From there, it should be easy to sort out how existing laws and regulatory processes that exist for the physical world could be extended to the digital world. There are few, if any, examples of harms that are being caused in digital spaces that do not already have existing relatable laws or regulatory structures that could be extended or modified to cover them. Conversely, what this government has done for nearly a decade is try to create new, catch-all regulatory, bureaucratic, and extrajudicial processes that would adapt to the needs of actors in the digital space instead of requiring them to adapt to our existing laws. All of these attempts have failed to become law, which is likely going to be the fate of C-63. This is a backward way of looking at things and has caused nearly a decade of inaction on much-needed modernization of existing systems and has translated into law enforcement not having the tools they need to prevent crime, which in turn causes harm to Canadians. It's also led to a balkanization of laws and regulations across Canadian jurisdictions, a loss of investment due to this uncertainty, and a lack of coordination with the international community. And again, ultimately, this all harms Canadians. C-63 takes this approach by listing only a very few of the harms that happen in online spaces and creates a new onerous and opaque extrajudicial bureaucracy while creating deep problems for Canadian charter rights. For example, Bill C-63 creates a new offence motivated by hatred provision that could see a life sentence applied to minor infractions under any act of Parliament, a parasitic provision that is unchecked in the scope of this legislation. This means words alone could lead to life imprisonment. While the government has attempted to argue that this is not the case, saying that a serious underlying act would have to occur for this provision to apply, that is simply not how this bill is written, and I ask colleagues to look at it. The bill seeks to amend Section 320 of the Criminal Code and reads, "Everyone who commits an offence under this Act or any other Act of Parliament is guilty of an indictable offence and liable to imprisonment for life." At the Justice Committee earlier this year, the minister stated, "The new hate crime offence captures any existing offence if it was hate-motivated. That can run the gamut from a hate-motivated theft all the way to a hate-motivated attempted murder. The sentencing range entrenched in Bill C-63 was designed to mirror the existing options for all of these potential underlying offences, from the most minor to the most serious offences on the books. That does not mean that minor offences will suddenly receive harsh offences. However, sentencing judges are required to follow legal principles. Hate-motivated murder will result in a life sentence. A minor infraction will not result in it." In this statement, the minister both admitted that this new provision could be applied to any act of Parliament, as the bill states, and that the government is relying upon the judiciary to ensure that maximum penalties weren't levelled against this minor infraction. Parliament cannot afford the government to be this lazy, and by that I mean not spelling out exactly what they intend a life sentence to apply to in law, as opposed to handing a highly imperfect judiciary an overbroad law that could have extreme negative consequences. Similarly, massive amounts of concerns from across the political spectrum raised regarding C-63's introduction of a so-called hate crime peace bond, calling this a pre-crime provision for speech. This is highly problematic because it explicitly extends this power to issue peace bonds to crimes of speech. which this bill does not adequately define nor provide any assurance that it would meet a criminal standard for hate. Equally as concerning, C-63 would create a new process for individuals and groups to complain to the Human Rights Commission that online speech directed at them is discriminatory. This process would be extrajudicial, not subject to the same evidentiary standards of a criminal court, and could take years to resolve. Findings would be based on a mere balance of probabilities rather than the standard criminal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The subjectivity of defining hate speech will undoubtedly lead to punishments for protected speech. The mere threat of human rights complaints will chill large amounts of protected speech, and the system will undoubtedly be deluged with a landslide of vexatious complaints. There certainly are no provisions in this bill to prevent any of this from happening. Nearly a decade ago, even the Toronto Star, hardly a bastion of conservative thought, wrote a scathing opinion piece opposing these types of provisions. The same principle should apply today. When these highly problematic components of this bill are overlaid upon the fact that we are presently living under a government that unlawfully invoked the Emergencies Act and who routinely gaslights Canadians who legitimately question efficacy or the morality of their policies as spreading misinformation, as the Minister of Justice did in his response to my question saying I had mischaracterized the bill, it's not a far leap to surmise that this new provision has a great potential for abuse. That should be true for any political stripe that's in government. The government's charter compliance statement, which is long and vague and only recently issued, should raise concerns for parliamentarians in this regard, as it relies on this statement. The effects of the bill on freedom of expression are outweighed by the benefits of protecting members of vulnerable groups. This government has already been found to have violated the Charter in the case of Bill C-69 for false presumptions on which one benefit outweighs others. I suspect this will be the same case for C-63 should it become law, which I hope it does not. I believe in the capacity of Canadians to express themselves within the bounds of protected speech and maintain the rule of law within our vibrant pluralism. Regardless of political stripe, we must value freedom of speech and due process because it's what prevents violent conflict. Speech already has clearly defined limitations under Canadian law. The provisions in C-63 I've just described are anathema to these principles. To be clear, Canadians should not be expected to have their right to protected speech chilled or limited in order to be safe online, which is what C-63 asks of them. C-63 also creates a new three-headed, yet-to-exist bureaucracy. It leaves much of the actual rules C-63 describes to be created and enforced under undefined regulations to be created by said bureaucracy at some much later date in the future. We can't wait to take action in many circumstances. As one expert described it to me, it's like vaguely creating an outline and expecting bureaucrats, not elected legislators, to color in the picture behind closed doors without any accountability to the Canadian public. This government should have learned from the costs associated with failing when they attempted this approach with Bill C-11 and C-18, but alas, here we are. This new bureaucratic process will be slow, onerous, and uncertain. If the government proceeds with it, it means Canadians will be left without protection and innovators and investors will be left without regulatory certainty needed to grow their businesses. It will also be costly. I've asked the Parliamentary Budget Officer to conduct an analysis of the cost associated with the creation of this bureaucracy, and he has agreed to undertake this task. No parliamentarian should even consider supporting this bill without understanding the resources the government intends to allocate to the creation of the new Digital Safety Commission, Digital Safety Ombudsman, and Digital Safety Office, particularly since the finding in this week's damning NSICOP report starkly outlined the opportunity cost of this government failing to allocate much-needed resources to the RCMP. Said differently, if this government cannot fund and maintain critical operations of the RCMP, who already have the mandate to enforce laws related to public safety, then Parliament should have grave, serious doubts about the efficacy of the government setting up 3 new bureaucracies to address issues that could likely be managed by existing regulatory bodies like the CRTC or in the enforcement of the Criminal Code. Also, Canadians should have major qualms about creating new bureaucracies which give power to well-funded and extremely powerful big tech companies to lobby and manipulate regulations to their benefit behind the scenes and out of the purview of Parliament. This approach won't necessarily protect Canadians and may create artificial barriers to entry for new, innovative industry players. The far better approach, again, is to adapt and extend long-existing laws and regulatory systems and properly resource their enforcement arms and require big tech companies and other actors in the digital space to comply with these laws, not the other way around. This approach would provide Canadians with real protections, not what amounts to a new, ineffectual complaints department with a high negative opportunity cost to Canadians. In no scenario should Parliament allow the government to entrench in legislation a power for social media companies to be arbiters of speech, which C63 risks doing. If the government wishes to further impose restrictions on Canadians' rights to speech, that should be a debate for Parliament to consider, not for regulators and tech giants to decide behind closed doors with limited accountability to the public. In short, this bill is completely flawed and should be abandoned, particularly given the minister's announcement this morning that he is unwilling to proceed with any sort of change to it in terms of scope. There is a better way, however. Here is an alternative, more effective, and more quickly implementable plan to protect Canadian safety in the digital age. It modernizes existing laws and processes to align with digital advancements. It protects speech not already limited in the criminal code and fosters an environment for innovation and investment in digital technologies. It proposes adequately resourcing agencies with existing responsibilities for enforcing the law, not creating extrajudicial bureaucracies that amount to a complaints department. To begin, the RCMP and many law enforcement agencies across the country are under-resourced after certain flavors of politicians gave much more than a wink and a nod to the defund the police movement for over a decade. This trend must immediately be reversed. Well-resourced and well-respected law enforcement is critical to a free and just society. Second, the government must also reform its watered-down bail policies that allow repeat offenders to commit crimes over and over again. Criminals in the digital space will never face justice no matter what laws are passed if the Liberal government's catch and release policies aren't reversed. I think of a woman in my city of Calgary who was murdered in broad daylight in front of an elementary school because her spouse was a catch and release Liberal bail policy, in spite of online harassment for her for a very long time. Third, the government must actually enforce...
Je pense un appel au règlement à l'honorable député de Drummond.
Avec mes excuses pour la collègue, je déteste interrompre comme ça en plein milieu d'un discours, mais on entend une vibration d'un téléphone ou d'un appareil qui doit être proche du micro et qui doit devenir très, très agaçant pour les interprètes. Je ne sais pas d'où ça vient exactement, mais si on peut demander aux collègues de faire attention à ça, de tenir les appareils loin des micros. Merci.
Okay, just ask the honourable member maybe to move the cell phone away from the microphone so that it doesn't vibrate on the microphone. So I think it's probably, yeah, so okay, the honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Third, the government must actually enforce laws that are already on the books but haven't been recently enforced due to a lack of extreme political will, disingenuous politics, and leadership, particularly as they relate to hate speech, and particularly in light of the rise of dangers currently faced by vulnerable Canadian religious communities, as the Minister mentioned, particularly Canada's Jewish community. This could be done via actions like ensuring the RCMP, including specialized integrated national security enforcement team and national security enforcement sections, are providing resources and working directly with appropriate provincial and municipal police forces to share appropriate information intelligence to provide protection to these communities, as well as making sure the security infrastructure program funding is actually accessible in an expedited manner so that community institutions and centres can enhance security measures at their gathering places. Fourth, for areas where modernization of existing regulations and the criminal code need immediate updating in order to reflect the digital age, and where there could be cross-partisan consensus, the government should undertake these changes in a manner which would do just that, allow for swift and nonpartisan passage through Parliament. These items could include some of the provisions discussed in C63, such as a duty to make content that sexually victimizes a child or re-victimizes a survivor and intimate content communicated without consent inaccessible to persons in Canada in certain circumstances, imposing certain duties to keep all records related to sexual victimization to online providers, making provisions for persons in Canada to make a complaint to existing enforcement bodies like the CRTC or the police, not a new bureaucracy that will take years to potentially materialize and be costly and or ineffective, that content on a social media service is content that sexually victimizes a child or re-victimizes a survivor or is intimate content communicated without consent, and authorizes a court to make orders requiring the operators of those services to make that content inaccessible to persons in Canada, and the proposed amendment to an act respecting the mandatory reporting of internet child pornography by persons who provide an internet service. Other provisions the government chose not to include in C63, but that should have been, and that Parliament should be considering in the context of harms that are being conducted online, must include the following: updating Canada's existing laws on the non-consensual distribution of intimate images to ensure that the distribution of intimate deepfakes is also criminalized, likely through a simple update to the criminal code. We could do this on division, or we could do this by unanimous consent today had the government taken the initiative to do so. This is already a major problem in Canada, with girls in high schools in Winnipeg seeing their intimate images of themselves, sometimes reports are saying being sexually violated, without any ability for the law to intervene. Other provisions, the government also needs to create a new criminal offense of online criminal harassment that would update the existing crime of criminal harassment to address the ease and anonymity of online criminal harassment. Specifically, this would apply to those who repeatedly send threatening and or explicit messages to content to people across the internet and social media when they know or should know that it is not welcome. This could include aggravating factors for repeatedly sending such material anonymously and be accompanied by a so-called digital restraining order that would allow victims of online criminal harassment to apply to a judge under strict certain circumstances to identify the harassment and end the harassment. This would both protect privacy, remove the onus on social media platforms from guessing when they should be giving identity to the police, and prevent the escalation of online harassment into physical violence. This would give police and victims a clear and easy to understand tools to prevent online harassment and associated escalation. This would address a major issue of intimate partner violence and make it easier to stop coercive control. As well, I'll note to the Minister that members of the governing Liberal Party agreed to the need for these exact measures at a recent meeting of PROC related to online harassment of elected officials this past week. Fifth, the government should consider a more effective and better way to regulate online platforms, likely under the authority of the CRTC and the Minister of Industry, to better protect children online while protecting charter rights. This path could include improved measures to do the following: through legislation, not backroom regulation, precisely in law define this duty of care required by online platforms. Some of these duties of care have already been mentioned in questions to the ministers today. This is what Parliament should be seized with, not allowing some unnamed future regulatory body to decide this for us while we have big tech companies and their lobbying arms defining that behind closed doors. That's our job, not theirs. Provide parents with safeguards, controls, and transparency to prevent harm to their kids when they are online. That could be part of the duty of care. Require that online platforms put the interests of children first with appropriate safeguards, again, in a legislated duty of care. Prevent and mitigate against self-harm, mental health disorders, addictive behaviors, bullying and harassment, sexual violence and exploitation, and the promotion of marketing and products that are unlawful for minors. All of these things are instances of duty of care. Implement privacy preserving and trustworthy age verification methods, which many platforms always have the capacity to do while prohibiting the use of a digital ID in any of these mechanisms, and ensure that the enforcement of these mechanisms, including through a system of administrative and penalties and consequences, are done through agencies which already exist, and also ensure that there's perhaps other remedy, such as the ability to seek civil or seek remedy for civil injury when that duty of care is violated. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a non-comprehensive list of online harms, but the point is we could come to consensus in this place on simple modernization issues that would update the laws now. I hope that the government will accept this plan. A shout out to Sean Phelan and David Murray, two strong and mighty workers that we didn't have an army of bureaucrats to do, but we came up with this. I hope that Parliament considers this alternative plan instead of C-63 because the safety of Canadians is at risk. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Speaker, I genuinely thank the member opposite for her contributions to today's debate because it's really important. I'm going to point out 4 things and ask her a question. The first is that with respect to my position on amendments, what I said, and I want to make sure it's crystal clear to Canadians watching, is that I'm open to amendments that would strengthen this bill that are made in good faith. Second point, Mr. Speaker, is that with respect to the freestanding hate crime, that's a provision that exists in 47 out of 50 states in the United States, and the nature of the penalty that would be applied in a given context of a hate crime will depend on the underlying offense. Uttering a threat that was motivated by hate will constitute less of a penalty than committing a murder that was motivated by hate. And for the members' benefit, 718.1 of the Criminal Code, which I do trust judges to interpret, specifically says that the penalty must always be proportionate to the gravity of the offense and the degree of the responsibility of the offender. With respect to the peace bond, what I would say to her point quite simply is that I do believe it's necessary to take a tool that is well known to criminal law and apply it in the context of a synagogue that's already been targeted with vandalism that may be targeted again, where there would be proof that we need to be put before a judge and where the safeguard would exist, where the Attorney General of jurisdiction would have to give consent before such a peace bond was pursued. She talked about the fact that criminal code tools should be used in the context of ensuring that we can tackle this pernicious information. What I would say to her is that law enforcement has asked us for the same tool that Amanda Todd's mother has asked us for, which is that the victimization of people even after death continues when
the Honourable Member of Calgary-Noso.
Mr. Speaker, I've outlined in detail why this bill is irremediable. It's not fixable. And it's not, you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, again, hardly a bastion of conservative thought. The Atlantic magazine has a huge expose this morning on why this bill is so flawed. I suspect it's why the bill has only put it up for debate. The government has only allowed it to come up for debate now. I don't expect to see it in the fall. So given that it's so flawed, it's incumbent upon the Minister of Justice to take the suggestions of the opposition seriously. I have outlined several very easy to pick out of my speech suggestions on how the minister could proceed. He could proceed likely on an expedited process under those situations. It sounds like my colleagues from the Bloc and the NDP have similar concerns. This bill cannot proceed in its current standards. And frankly, Canadians shouldn't be expected to trade their rights for safety online, and they shouldn't have to expect a government that has dragged their heels for nearly a decade to continue with the facade that they actually care about this issue or have a plan to address it. We've given them one, they should take it.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's kind of nice to see towards the end of our session that there are more and more school groups visiting. And I think that's a strategy teachers are using to show students that it's really not that boring what we do here. So that said, Mr. Speaker, I listened to my colleague's speech, and there were some interesting points she made. The Conservatives don't often make proposals about regulating online content, and I did hear some suggestions there, and there may be some things we can agree on. Would my colleague agree with the Bloc that the Part 1 of the bill should be divided or split off from the rest because people mostly agree with that, in principle, and then that we take time to study part 2, which contains things that require much more in-depth discussion in our view. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I think the unfortunate thing is that this government is close to the end of its mandate. It doesn't have a lot of public support across the country, and the reality is that even if the government said that they were going to split it, which they've just said that they weren't, it's not going to become law, likely. And certainly the regulatory process is not going to happen prior to the next election, even if it's rammed through. And the problem that's facing Canadians is the solutions that are required have problems that need to be addressed today. So I would suggest that what is actually needed is a separate, a completely different piece of legislation, which outlines the suggestions I have in there. It's unfortunate that the government, with their army of bureaucrats, did not have to do it, or was not able to do it, that it's the opposition that has to do it. But I am certainly willing to work with my opposition colleagues on another piece of legislation could address these issues, find areas of commonality so that we can protect Canadians from online harms.
Now we have time for a minute question and answer here because we're going into to statements right after this. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby, quickly.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the members' hard work in terms of tackling issues like harassment and the distribution of non-consensual images. She's very sincere in this regard. She's flagged the issue of resources, which is unclear what the government is actually going to provide in terms of resources. I do note this has been an ongoing problem over the last 20 years with cutbacks to law enforcement. And she notes as well the impact of big tech. And I wanted her to comment on the issue of what is a substantial missing piece, I believe, in the legislation around algorithm transparency, currently before the U.S. Congress, and needs to be addressed absolutely. Big tech often promoting non-consensual images through their algorithms, hate through their algorithms without any sort of oversight or responsibility. How does the member feel about that missing piece?
And under 30 seconds, the honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, with regard to resources, this is why I did ask the Parliamentary Budget Officer to conduct an analysis of the resources required or that the government was anticipating for the creation of their bureaucracy, because I believe that those resources would likely be much better allocated into other places. So my colleague can wait for that report and perhaps reemphasize the need to the Parliamentary Budget Officer to speed that along. The second thing is with regard to algorithmic transparency. This is why I think that we need to have a legislated duty of care. If we proceeded on the principle of a legislated duty of care of social media operators, then we could discuss what needs to be in there. Certainly algorithmic transparency and bias that's used in AI systems that could be potentially injurious in a variety of ways is something.
When we return, the honourable member will have about 3 minutes of questions and comments from me.